Before we get into detail in terms of that observational research and experimentation, let's talk about some key terminology. So let's start first with the term treatment. The term treatment is a manipulation or intervention on the participants performed or assigned by the researcher in the study. So if we're doing an experiment, then we will choose a treatment group, and that particular group will get the diet, the drug, whatever it is we are trying to assess, right? So we want to see if this diet helps them lose weight. We want to see if the blood pressure medicine lowers their blood pressure, right? So that treatment is what it is we are trying to assess. And in an experimental design, we would want to have a treatment group and a control. Now, the treatment is applied to an experimental unit. An experimental unit is going to be that basic entity to which the treatment is assigned. When we talked about surveys and other research methods, we had an observational unit. So when you had your data set that had each survey respondent, that was an observational unit. Here we have an experimental unit. And it doesn't have to be a person. So we might be doing the experimental design in terms of maybe we are treating fungus or pesticides on plants. So an experimental unit is a single plant. Or maybe we are looking at treating ringworm in pets. And so each animal is one of the experimental units. So if we have a human experimental unit, we call it a subject. We can also call it a participant. Okay. So an example of a randomized experiment, suppose we want to determine the effectiveness of 3 diets for obese teenage girls. In the experiment, 30 girls were randomly assigned to 3 diets. So we take our 30 participants and we put 10 into treatment A and 10 into treatment B and 10 into treatment C. So each teenager was put on one diet for a month, and at the end of the month, the total weight loss was calculated to the nearest pound. An example of a randomized experiment. So the treatment is the type of diet, and we have our 3 groups, and then we can compare, and we'll talk about different statistical tests, but we can test to see if the average weight loss is different between treatment A, treatment B, and treatment C. Now, when we are doing experimentation, we have to be concerned about confounding. So that's another key term we need to make sure that we know. So confounding is when there are multiple things that could be causing the effect that we are seeing. So we have a variable that affects the response variable, but the variable is also related to some other explanatory variables. So we need to distinguish between a response variable and an explanatory variable. Our response variable is the variable we are interested in explaining. Okay, so this is going to be our dependent variable. So we have our independent variable that we're going to, our treatment or control, and then we want to see what happens to something else. So if we are going to do diet A, B, and C, then the response variable is going to be the weight loss. The explanatory variable is that one that we are assuming is going to explain what is happening to that response variable. And so that would be diet A, and diet B, and diet C. So the different diets, our treatments, are the explanatory variable, also called an independent variable or a predictor variable. This is the one we are going to try to test to see if it will change that dependent or response variable. Okay. The challenge with confounding is that there might be something else that is causing the change in the response variable. So, for example, I did a study and with some colleagues, and we wanted to look at what most helps students learn. So the idea is that if we have more active learning, so games, then the students would enjoy it more. they would have this knowledge, they would hang their hat on those feelings and the things they did, and so they would retain it longer. So if we taught them in more of an engaging way, 6 months later, they would remember the content better. So here, our explanatory variable is going to, or our independent variable is going to be the method we taught them with. Engaging versus, say, traditional chalk and talk. The old school instructor writes things on the boards and students write it down. So there's our explanatory variable. Our response variable would be the ability to recall materials 6 months later. And our hope is that if we taught you a more engaging method, then it would change the amount you recall. Well, when we go to do this study, the challenge we have is that there is a confounding variable. And the confounding variable is that not only is there a difference for some students in how they were taught, right? So I teach with games and activities, but if we are then comparing other students who learned from an instructor who didn't teach with games and activities, there's more than just the difference between how they were taught. There's the confounding variable of its two different instructors. So is it really the fact that I taught with games and another instructor taught with chalk and talk that is the reason the students have different amounts of recall? Or is it the instructor themselves? So maybe the students were more attached or engaged with one instructor versus another, and so that was why they recalled or didn't recall. And so there's this other variable there that can cause confounding. So the effect of the confounding variable on the response variable is that we can't separate what's really causing that change in recall. We don't know if it's the method that it was taught with or the instructor themselves. We can't separate the two. You don't want to have confounding variables because then you don't know what is really causing that impact. Remember, what we really want with experimental design is to be able to get to cause. We want a treatment. We want to know if that treatment is effective. Okay? And so the challenge with confounding is it can cause the appearance of association that does not actually exist. So maybe students remember things better 6 months later, not because of how they were taught, but because of whether or not they like the instructor. Confounding variables can mask the effect of the association, makes it appear as if there is no relationship or that there is a relationship when maybe there's not, because there's some other variable that's not being accounted for. Another example of confounding, so we could look here at this data. Is there a relationship between the number of pages in a book and the price of the book? So if we're looking at our data, in this particular example here, we can see on our scatter plot our price versus pages for the different types of books. And we can look at our table of information. So as we look at those, do we see that there is a relationship or no relationship? In fact, this one here, we don't look like there's much of a relationship. So if we look at table 4.1, do we see a relationship? Does price increase with the number of pages? And you can see that looks like there's no relationship. The higher page numbers have low prices, lower page numbers have high prices, but there's also low ones mixed in. So it looks like there's no relationship there. But when we separate out the hardcover and the paperback, then we can see for the paperback, they're all the same price, regardless the number of pages. When you look at the hardcover, see there might be this kind of relationship here. So hardcover, pages increase, the price goes up, but for paperback, no relationship. And if we simply just looked at this table here on the left, it looks like no relationship at all, but perhaps there is one here for hardcover books. So binding is a variable that's not in the table on the left and is impacting whether or not we see that relationship. Other examples of confounding. So we have an observational study found that individuals who consume the most coffee have the highest risk of heart disease. All right. So if those who consume the most coffee have the highest risk of heart disease, then perhaps we should all just stop drinking coffee. right? And so the question is that what is the cause, or is there something else that is related that's not being measured in the study? We could look at a case study here. People who attend church regularly have lower blood pressure. So perhaps we should lay off the coffee and all go to church. But could be some underlying variable that's not being measured. Maybe people who go to church are more active, and those who attend church services virtually or watch church services online or just like to sleep in, that they are less active, and so they have higher blood pressure. So there could be some other variable that is not included. And we have to consider that when we're designing our research project, our experimentation, whether there are confounding variables. And as we design the experiment, remember, we want to control for everything we can so that the only difference between the treatment group and the non-treatment group is the treatment itself, right? So we want to control everything else, and we want to make sure that all the other relevant variables are modeled or considered or controlled so that we don't have this confounding effect. So confounding variables, to be a confounding variable, they have to affect the response variable, and they have to be related to the explanatory variable. So you got to be careful about confounding. All right, so we've talked about some key terminology. We talked about confounding. We talked about response and explanatory variables. We've talked about experimental units and treatments. So now in the next videos, we're going to dive into observational research that is more medical related, and then we'll talk about experiments as well.